Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today and welcome back to the Bulletin podcast. I'm your host, Charina Garcia, and I'm here with WR's Director of Visa Consulting, Charlie Oppenheim, to recap the June Visa Bulletin and talk about what it means for the HR, immigration, and global mobility folks listening in on Spotify or watching on YouTube today. Okay, before we dive in today, we'd love to hear any feedback or suggestions that listeners have on the podcast. So please share them in the comments or reach out to us directly. We also hope that you consider following the podcast on Spotify or subscribing to WR Immigration on YouTube. Okay, let's dive into the June Visa Bulletin. So Charlie, can you recap the highlights of the employment-based categories this month?
Sure. In terms of China, none of the employment dates advanced for the month of June. This was not totally unexpected. I had been projecting typically in the first through third preference up to a 3-week advancement, but up to means 0 to 3 weeks, with the 3-week maybe being an average over the June through September timeframe. So there is still potential hope for movement in the China dates for July through September. In terms of the India, only the India third preference and third other worker dates advanced by 1 week. That was the projected forward movement of 1 week. I do not expect a tremendous advancement of the employment first or second preference India date now through September, maybe up to 1 week at most. As we enter the end of the year, we're starting to run out of numbers, or they are starting to run out of numbers. In terms of the rest of world, none of the rest of world final action dates advanced. I was expecting that there could be some limited movement of the dates for June and through September with week averages, but it has been announced in the June bulletin that the State Department expects that the employment second and third preference final action dates will need to be retrogressed for the month of July in order to hold number use within the annual limits. This is a little surprising to me, given the fact that the dates had moved so rapidly for the month of April and had moved for the period of January through April, that they would now, 3 months later, be needing to retrogress the dates. It would have seemed to have been a little bit more prudent to have moved the dates at a slower pace, especially the April advancement, to try to minimize the need to retrogress dates later in the summer, knowing that because they haven't had final action dates established, they knew that they had enough pending demand that they could have advanced the dates later in the summer and still maximize number use. So again, it's somewhat surprising that they would be needing to retrogress the July dates for employment second and third preference.
So could there have been some sort of spike or something that happened for them to have done that, or miscalculation?
Obviously, there was a spike in demand, but the question is, why wasn't that spike in demand expected? And again, the fact that they have final action dates imposed means that there had been other demand, quote, stacking up with later priority dates. And the advantage of having that is that you have a known quantity of demand that you can tap into at a future time. So they could have moved the dates in recent months at a slower pace to make sure that their estimates of number use were accurate. And then if they saw that their number estimates were a little bit high, they would have plenty of time, say in the July through September timeframe, to have advanced the final action dates at a more rapid pace, knowing they had a pool of applicants to tap into and still maximize number use under the annual limits. Instead, they have moved the dates early only to turn around and have to retrogress them, which was unfortunately a kind of a normal situation in the past 2 or 3 fiscal years. They've had periods where they've advanced the dates very rapidly only to have retrogressions later in the fiscal year.
But If we compared it to when you were at Department of State, the retrogression would happen typically in which month?
Typically, I would try to hold the retrogressions of any dates until August or September. And again, I would often minimize the date's movement earlier so that I could, try to avoid the need to retrogress a final action date. It does happen. Sometimes you do get more actual demand than you expected. But again, that is one reason when you've had that situation where you've had to have multiple retrogressions in recent years, it, would have been maybe more prudent to move the dates at a slower pace to potentially avoid having to do the same this fiscal year, especially so early in the fiscal year.
Well, I mean, we haven't seen any movement since April, right? For
Correct. And I
categories.
think that I totally understand what appears to have been this State Department's policy of making the largest movement of the rest of world final or all the final action dates on a quarterly basis, meaning at the beginning of October, there were rapid advancements, the beginning of January advancements, and again in April, making rapid advancements, and then subsequent incremental monthly advancements if necessary to try to maximize number use. By doing so, they can see, okay, our estimates of how many numbers to give out based on the date for April are correct or not correct, and then make subsequent changes. But again, they could have done so at a slower pace. For example, the rest of world date advanced from November 22nd in March. It was November 22nd of 22, and they advanced it to January 15th of 2023, only to hold it for the last 2 months and now retrogress. So maybe it would have been better to, instead of moving it so rapidly, maybe only move it from November to sometime in December, and then, maybe had a little bit slower movements that would have potentially eliminated the need to retrogress the date as early as July, even though that still may have needed to occur in August or September.
Okay. And then do you think rest of world EB1 is going to remain current?
I think that, yes. I think that rest of world employment first preference will, remain current through the end of the year. But again, given the fact that the second and third preference, they've had notes about the upcoming retrogressions, I would be alert to potential problems in the first, just in case they should occur.
Okay. And then a lot of concern about Schedule A nurses born in the Philippines. What is your prediction on that?
I think that the Philippine third preference final action date will remain at the rest of world date. I had mentioned in earlier podcast that I thought in August or September that the Philippine third date may fall behind that of the rest of world third, but that was on the assumption that the rest of world third preference date was going to continue to advance. The fact that they already have said that it's going to retrogress, that should eliminate any need for any further change in the Philippine date.
Okay. And then let's talk a little bit about family-based. What are we seeing in the family-based categories, and what can you share, and any predictions?
There was some movement, particularly in the family F2A, rest of world, and the F3 final action dates. Both of those advanced significantly. I would expect that most of the family dates, first through fourth, I would expect fairly steady movement now through the end of the year. Even though we didn't see any first F2B or F4 for June, I would expect to see it in the future. The reason being, the State Department is still trying to recover from the impact of when they weren't able to process at overseas posts. And their goal, I know, would be to maximize family-sponsored number use under the 226,000 annual limit. And to do so, they need to be advancing the dates to make numbers available.
Okay. So that's your prediction for family-based, some forward movement, but no retrogressions.
No, I don't see any need for retrogressions in the family sponsored. The fact that they have been well under the annual limit in the family sponsored for fiscal 2023, there were approximately 21,000 under the limit. There's no reason to believe that they shouldn't be very close to the annual limit in fiscal 2024, and that could require the more rapid advancements of the family sponsored dates.
Yeah, so when I speak at many universities, I get a lot of questions. People are married to a green card holder. Should they still have their employer sponsor them for a green card? And typically I tell them, you should just choose as many paths as you can. Like if your employer is willing to sponsor you under the employment base, and then your spouse is filing an F2A, because as we can see, F2A was current at some time, but now there's a significant backlog, right? And so even if you're an EB3, I guess an EB3 third preference, employment base, they're processing November 22nd, 2022 versus an F2A, which is November 15, 2021. So it is prudent to be sponsored under both categories, right, Charlie?
Right. It's always important to file under as many categories as you're eligible. Whichever one comes up first, you'll benefit from that, but you just want to increase your opportunity. I do believe that the F2A date should, based on the application filing date, I think that date should continue to advance at a fairly rapid pace in the coming years. Part of the reason for the backlog and the slow movement of that date was they were recovering from the effects of COVID when overseas processing was minimized, and they had a backlog of cases in all the family categories, which they had to kind of catch up with all the ones that should have been processed or could have been processed during those years. Plus, they were having more people file. But again, I think that the State Department has done an excellent job in catching up, and therefore that backlog should be eliminated, allowing more consistent forward movement of the dates in the coming years.
Yeah, and then what we're also seeing is more EB2 national interest waivers being filed. So a lot of our clients are looking at the NIW versus the PERM. And then, of course, once they qualify under the NIW, because of the executive order under President Biden to encourage more approvals for those who are in specific industries, particularly AI. And with the election coming up in November, we're telling all of our clients to, get those NIWs filed. You can premium process them. You can get a decision in 45 business days. So it's a good idea if your employees haven't been thinking about NIW to seek an assessment on that. Any final thoughts, Charlie, you want to share?
The key point, and I've said this before, is always attempt to keep your scheduled appointment and do not, unless it's extenuating circumstances, I would suggest not rescheduling your appointment to a later month, because a person may have been scheduled for a June appointment. If they happen to reschedule their appointment to July, then they may have, rescheduled themselves out of the opportunity for a visa, because you never know about the potential retrogressions. So always attempt to appear at your scheduled interview. If by any chance there's a refusal, attempt to overcome that refusal in that month, because a number is being, quote, held for you. But if you do not either appear for your interview, resulting in issuance, or overcome a refusal in that month, the number would not necessarily be available in a subsequent month.
Yep. So thanks, Charlie, and everyone who tuned in today. See you next time.